Hi, I'm Jim Shepard, the Director of Preservation and Facilities at Washington National Cathedral, and I'm joined here today by Joe Alonso, our head stonemason, and we would like to share with you a little restoration update as to the efforts that we have put forth so far to do earthquake repairs after the August 23rd, 2011 earthquake. We like to show this photo just to remind everybody what we used to look like pre-August 23rd, 2011. For those of you who have forgotten, notice no scaffold. The earthquake was centered in Mineral, Virginia, and that 5.8 magnitude earthquake on August 23rd, 2011 did about $32 million of damage to the cathedral. And just to walk you through the damage, we'll talk a little bit about the damage, and then we'll also talk about our stabilization efforts and where we are with our restoration efforts. You can see from these various slides the level of damage that occurred at the cathedral. The energy of the earthquake vibrated through the building and really had the biggest impact on the taller, slender pinnacles at the tops and roofs of the cathedral. And when you are down on the ground, you don't really see this kind of damage, but when you get up into the gutters and you look closely, you'll start to see that the pinnacles are twisted and various pieces are rotated, and it really starts to give you a better picture of how we had the $32 million in damage. Notice how the stones broke off, and Joe, I don't know if you want to add to any of this.
Yeah, the photos some of the previous photos of the central tower were taken immediately after the quake, and what struck me, my crew and I, we were on site that day, luckily working on the ground, and we were on the west end of the cathedral during the actual quake, making sure that the public got out of the cathedral safely and the building was properly evacuated. But what was amazing after all that had occurred and we kind of regained our senses, I noticed a crowd gathering on the north lawn of the cathedral and folks looking up at the building, and the photos that you just saw of the central tower and of the twisted pinnacles and of the southwest pinnacle of the tower missing. I just couldn't believe when I first saw that. I looked up and said, is this what I'm really seeing? The top of the central tower, southwest pinnacle gone, and the other three twisted like a top. That was my first impression of the magnitude of the damage that had occurred.
And of course, if you look at the spectrum of the damage, the areas structurally that we had the most impact, the earthquake had the most impact on, were the flying buttresses on the east end. So the cathedral started construction in 1907 on the east end, and it moved forward 83 years to completion in 1990 on the west end. But some of the earliest structural elements, those 6 flying buttresses on the east end, you can see from the photographs, those flying buttresses slightly pulled away from the building and then resettle as a result of the movement from the earthquake, and you got movement of stone that created gaps where you could actually see right through mortar joints, and stone rubbing on stone that caused things to crack and separate. So that was a real area that we needed to focus on as part of the repairs. So we had the seismic event, and then the next step obviously was to be able to reopen our doors. Unlike the Washington Monument that basically closed for the duration after the earthquake, it was really important for us to continue with our programs and our worship and our various events and tours to get our doors back open. So we had a big push after the earthquake to try and stabilize everything so we could get people back into the building. And that included bringing cranes onto the site and lifting pieces off that were destabilized, but also putting stabilization scaffold up on the central tower and other areas to make sure that those pieces that were slightly rotated could be held in place for a long time.
If I may add, just looking at this photo of the crane, talking about those 2.5 months after the earthquake was a very intense time of assessing the damage and using that big crane and other cranes to remove the most heavily damaged pieces of stone that were on the building.
So one of the things I tell people when they see the scaffold, there's oftentimes a misrepresentation of what is up on the central tower, but that scaffold up there is really stabilization scaffold. There's no work going on there. It was put in place immediately after the earthquake to stabilize what was up there until we could get the funds in hand to repair it. And I think that's something for people to remember and take away and make sure they convey to people, is that symbol, that central tower, that scaffold on it is really stabilization scaffold only. We were able to implement repairs elsewhere, but in particular, that scaffold on the central tower is stabilization only. There's some great photos, of course, of Joe taking some of the work that he so enjoyed putting up. He had to take it down, unfortunately. I'm sure it must have been heartbreaking.
Yeah, in this photo, in particular, Andy and I are in what's called a man basket on one crane, and we had another crane next to us pulling some loose stones off. And I remember during that time, in that particular moment, saying to Andy, "Can you believe this? I mean, we are taking the building apart." Just that moment there, that photograph reminds me of what I was saying to Andy at that time.
So I think it's important to understand that immediately after the earthquake, we went into a sort of assessment and stabilization mode. We were able to raise about $10 million of the $32 million or more that we need to do all the repairs. And with that $10 million, we spent the first $2 million on the stabilization effort. And we also had a difficult access team, the DAT team, people with nerves of steel who suspended themselves from the outside of the building with iPads dangling from their belts so that they could actually digitally record the things they observed while they were hanging from those ropes. And you can see in the images here, they are hanging from the central tower and trying to do that level of inspection. And what all that resulted in is basically a very comprehensive report that identified where we had damage. So you can see from the diagram here that green is good, red is bad. Notice there's a lot of red. And in particular, there's red on the areas that are on the east side of the cathedral that coincide with the oldest part of construction. So again, that comes back to those flying buttresses. But you also notice all the red squares that have to do with the pinnacles on all of those buttresses. In coincidence with doing the assessment, we also put some netting on the inside so that we could reopen the doors on the inside. So the earthquake shake created a whole series of little debris fields of loose mortar that fell from the ceiling. So we had to put something in to guarantee that it was safe to come back into the building. So that netting went up that spanned basically from clear story to clear story on the interior of the building so that we could reopen. So we got through the stabilization phase, and the next portion was really to plan out our earthquake repairs and to sort out with the remaining funds that we had in hand what we could implement. So one of the things that we did not have were drawings. Believe it or not, it took 83 years of construction for the cathedral and 30,000 drawings, shop drawings on all kinds of hand-drawn, beautiful drawings to create the cathedral, but none of them reflected an as-built, accurate depiction of what was actually constructed. So we actually hired a firm to come in with a digital scanning device, which is a 3D scanning device that basically captures a whole series of point clouds of information using a three-dimensional scanner on a tripod that sort of looks like a camera. You can see in these photographs. And what it does is you put it down on the ground and it captures everything it can see. So you can see from this image here the location of the scanner in front of the cathedral, and everything that it couldn't capture is basically in black. And they did about 890 scans of the cathedral. And basically those scans were put together to create a three-dimensional point cloud of the cathedral that's very highly accurate. And by the way, they had a lot of fun with their scanning devices. They scanned some of our most treasured items on the inside, such as our Canterbury pulpit, and they were able to actually use the 3D scan to make a three-dimensional print, which is something that's very popular now in using three-dimensional information. And of course, the dean always likes to joke that if they can scan and print out the Canterbury pulpit, they should be able to scan and print out him to put in the pulpit. So that hasn't happened yet, but someday. The end result of all of this really is these two-dimensional, highly accurate electronic drawings that we needed to be able to plan out the repair project. So now we have accurate elevation drawings of all 4 of the elevations of the building, as well as floor plans of all of the floor levels of the cathedral. While we were creating these drawings, our consultants actually went up on scaffolding. We put investigative scaffolding in certain areas of the cathedral. We had scaffolding up in the west balcony and in the north transept balcony. And they were getting up there and getting close to the stone at the ceiling and tapping it out, sounding it out, seeing where the damage was, because obviously we didn't have the advantage of getting scaffold up everywhere on the inside of the building to inspect everything before the contractor came on board. So we were trying to get representative areas so we could project out what the damage was and plan out a project. So that basically, we've now spent $2 million on stabilization and approximately $2 million on planning for and moving into putting a project out to bid. The job went out to bid in February of 2014, and we awarded the contract to Davis Construction in March of 2014. And the first thing they came on board and did was organize a way in which to move around the very complicated scaffold on the inside of the building. We gave them a few requirements. We basically said, you need to be able to put scaffold in place that allows us to continue to function on the inside of the building if we have an event or a service. And we also need to have you have all that scaffold out of view of cameras if we should have a state event inside the nave. So pretty complicated set of standards that we put in front of them in order to accomplish this job. But what they came up with was really a very creative solution. They came up with these aluminum trusses called hacky trusses that span from a clear-story ledge to clear-story ledge and allowed us to basically do all of this work from a platform set about 65 feet above the ground in the nave. So that all the workmen basically worked from scaffold from that 65-foot level up to the high ceiling while all of our activities continued below. It was pretty remarkable that we were able to continue to do all that work while the construction work was going on. And in these images, you can see the workmen came in at night and they hoisted the scaffold up, these hacky trusses up, and set them on the clear-story ledges, put this deck in, and then they built fixed scaffold from that deck up to the high ceiling. Here they are actually placing those hacky trusses on the clear-story, and you can notice how dangerously close they come to our stained glass windows. It was a real nail biter that we wanted to make sure that those trusses didn't have impact on our stained glass. You notice we did put plywood protection in front of the most vulnerable areas of the stained glass, and believe it or not, we only had one or two very minor incidents related to our stained glass as a result of this installation.
Speaking of the hackies, the way they got them up, what really saved them tremendous amount of time and effort was there were chandeliers originally planned to be hung from the high ceiling of the nave and the transepts, and as that ceiling was being constructed, small pipes were built that went through the stone vaulting into the space above, and that was a lifesaver for the scaffold crew because they were able to thread their cables and pulleys through those small holes in the ceiling, which enabled them to pull them up.
So similar to what Joe was talking about how they meshed cables in holes in the ceilings where there were once chandeliers, that was actually a similar approach that we went through for the crossing. If you can imagine, the crossing doesn't have a clear-story ledge, so you can't span clear-story to put decking in to get up to the high ceiling. So the contractors came up with yet another creative solution. It's a similar system to what they use to paint undersides of bridges where you can't have a scaffold that goes down because you're over water. It's called Quick Deck. And what they do is they attach the cables to a deck down on the ground. The cables have motors that are in each of the four corners of the platform. You've got 8 men on the platform, 4 to man the motors and 4 to make sure the cables don't get twisted into the motors. And then they ride the platform up to the 65-foot height so that it's the same level as the platforms we created with the hacky trusses. Now these guys, they really have nerves of steel because not only do they raise it up, but then they sit on the edge of it and they put out extenders to fill out the platform at the crossing to meet the platforms of the other areas. So they basically build it all up in the air, suspended over the crossing. It was really incredible. But what that allowed us to do was build then a fixed scaffold from that platform up to the crossing ceiling. And Joe and I were joking with Gina Campbell, our director of worship, because basically that's right over our main worship platform. So every Sunday we had worship and could continue all that we do, and of course we made sure to not inform them of all that was dangling over their heads for risk that they might not want to sit under there if they knew what was over their heads. But it was really an amazing engineering feat to be able to get that close to the high ceiling and to be able to do that all, as I said, with continuing to function below as though nothing was going on over your head. What that crossing platform also allowed us to do was get access to the rood beam, which is basically right at the juncture between the crossing and the great choir. And we were able to clean it and wax it, and we actually found a little surprise on that rood beam as part of all this, so it was sort of an interesting story. Joe, you want to share what we found?
Yeah, once we got up to the level of the rood beam, right under the crucifixion scene, we saw a bag, a plastic, something wrapped up in a plastic bag, and we retrieved it, and inside was a copy of the Washington Post and some notes and documentation from 1986. The crew had been up there in '86 cleaning the rood beam, and doing some repairs to the cross. The cross was found to be very unstable and moving, and that is when steel cables were installed on that cross to anchor it to the ceiling. So the crew that was up there doing that left drawings and a Washington Post from early 1986 with President Reagan on the front page, and it was put away in that spot. And then I had totally forgotten about this, but in 1994, we had a large lift in the cathedral that someone was trying to sell us. And I remember the salesman said, "You can hold on to this lift that will go 90 feet into the ceiling. Use it for a week, see if you like it." And we had it in the cathedral, and we were using it for various things, cleaning up into the triforium. It supposedly went up 90 feet, but I'll tell you, I did not take it up 90 feet. It was quite unstable. Once you got up past about 60 feet, it was very unstable. We were able, our head carpenter and I took it up to the actual rood beam in 1994, and that's as high as we went, but we rediscovered the time capsule package, and we had dusted off the beam and did some minor cleaning on it at that time, and then I took a front page of the Washington Post from 1994 with President Clinton on the cover, and did a little note that we were up there and put it away and completely forgot about it. So now in this go-around, Jim added a few other things to it that he can describe.
So I basically created a memo that summarized the history of everything that had happened with the room beam, including our cleaning it as part of this earthquake repair. But just coincidentally, we hosted a media event up on the scaffold in February that resulted in Joe and I both being in the Washington Post. So we actually put that Washington Post into the time capsule along with our memo, and now it's up there until the next person has the brave nerves to be able to get up to that height and discover what's on top of that root beam. So,
hopefully well after our time.
yeah. So we talked a lot about getting prepared for all of this work and getting Davis on board, but once we got the scaffold in place, the workmen basically got on top of that fixed scaffold that rested on the dance platforms that were on top of the hackies, and they cleaned the stone. So you got to imagine those boss stones in most cases had not been touched since they went in. So some of those date back to the early periods of the construction, early 1900s, 1920s, and that spans all the way through the completion in 1990. So there was a lot of accumulation of dirt and soil and grime on those boss stones. But I think what Joe and I really enjoyed seeing is what you don't see from the ground are all the wonderful carvings on the sides of the boss stones, but because they're 100 feet up, so all you really see is what faces down to the ground, and the scaffold allowed us not only to clean them, but also to really see up close the craft and carving on the sides of those stones, and it's really incredible, the amount of effort that went into something that most people would never see. So in addition to doing a lot of the cleaning of the boss stones, we cleaned the masonry in the great choir and in the apse, which, as I said earlier, had not been touched in some cases since it all was installed in the 1920s.
Yeah. That photo there, I remember, is of the high vaulting right above the high altar, which means that area was completed around 1918, and no one had been up there since that time. And it's amazing to see in the photo, that center portion is the uncleaned, dirty area. You think about the many years of candles and incense and smoke going up into that ceiling, and they literally, what you see in that photo is just sponges and water is what what our contractors used to clean it. Many gallons of water and sponges to clean it before they then began the actual work of repairing the stone. In this next photo, you see them grinding out the mortar joints that were damaged, and if you look closely, they're using a complete dustless system. The grinders, all the power tools they use had vacuum attachments, and in the case they didn't have a vacuum attachment, you had another workman there holding a vacuum right on the grinder and on the piece of equipment. So they were capturing almost all of the dust that was coming out, and that was very dusty, dirty work.
One of the things we always say is that five most expensive words in a restoration project are while you are at it. So we did planned mostly to do all this earthquake repair, but you have to imagine that given the scaffolding system that I described earlier, that was not an inexpensive scaffolding system. So we wanted to take advantage of having that access. So one of the things that we added into the scope was basically cleaning all the stained glass of the cathedral and also replacing the sealant where the stained glass meets the masonry. So all of the stained glass windows at the clear story level were cleaned, and most of the sealant where it was necessary was replaced.
And there were a few little nicks and dings on the glass itself that were also taken care of. Our stained glass restorer, Andrew Goldcool, examined every window once the scaffold was built and did any small repairs that needed to be made.
As I mentioned, we did continue to clean all of the masonry. Some of it was just general cleaning, but we also had to do some specific cleaning in certain areas where stains had accumulated over time with a specific poultice that actually has a long history with the cathedral.
Yes, the poultice that was used is a mixture that my predecessor, Billy Cleland, here at the cathedral, found in some of the old files in the construction office, but it's a recipe for a poultice that was designed by the Indiana Limestone Company back in 1929, and we took that mixture over the years and used it quite successfully to clean the dark brown alkaline stains that were forming up in the ceiling. And those were formed, those occurred due to roof leaks from years before. But the contractor that we have is a good contractor, good experienced restoration contractor, but they had never heard of this poultice mix of ours, and we provided samples, and it was part of the specification for the job that this was the mixture that was going to be used for the stain removal. And it's a poultice that consists of soda ash, fire clay, and, well, the original recipe called for ground up paper pulp, but we ended up using rolls of toilet paper, which worked just as well. And you mix it into a pasty mortar-like consistency, and you apply it to the stain as if you were plastering over it. And as that material dries, it pulls the stain out of the stone and leaves it looking very clean. So we did a lot of that type of cleaning, while, again, as Jim said, while we were up there.
So as of just a few weeks ago, we were able to come to completion of the cleaning of the high ceiling on the interior, getting the scaffold all down, and getting all the netting down. And actually, Easter of this year, 2015, we were able to celebrate Easter for the first time netting and scaffold free, which was pretty exciting. So we've done a lot about talking about the interior. There is one unique component to the interior that a lot of people don't know about, and it has to do with a ceiling tile, an acoustic tile called acoustilith. And basically, there was a father-son Spanish family that came to the United States in the early 1900s, and they are famous for creating a patented lightweight vaulting system that has to do with terracotta tile. And in the midst of developing this, it became very prominent in a lot of church structures that were built in the early 1900s. They also patented a material to apply to that vaulting that would help cut down reverberation, or the bouncing of noise inside the space, so that you could hear better what the person in the pulpit was saying. And it took off in popularity in most churches that were built in the early 1900s, and we were part of that group. So the construction portions that aligned with when they made this tile, they started making it in about 1917. So we have this tile in our several bays of our side aisles, and in our triforium area, and also in the crossing and north transept high ceilings. So again, one of the things that we took advantage of while the scaffold was up was making sure that all of that acoustic tile was clean and that it was repaired. There was some earthquake damage to that tile. It is lightweight, it's very porous, it's kind of like concrete block. There are lots of nooks and crannies in it, but it's also very brittle. So there were a lot of cracked tiles and loose tiles as it relates to the earthquake. But we had the advantage of having another interested donor who wanted to support the improvement of the acoustics. So we have that acoustilith also at our the crossing high ceiling and the north transept high ceiling. And obviously, it was wonderful when it was put in, because that predated electronic augmentation of people in the pulpit. But now with all the electronic devices that can help you to augment what the person in the pulpit is saying so everyone can hear, the musicians really wanted this tile corrected so that it could improve the reverberation for the music. So while we had the tile up, we took the advantage of bringing a very experienced acoustician on board and a conservator on board. You can see from this photo, we had a little testing lab for Acoustilith where we tested acoustics and coding of the acoustics, cleaning of it, repairs, to really get down the formula of how we hoped to repair these and coat these before we got up to the high ceiling to do the work. And our conservators went around with little mallets and sounded out all the tiles, and in many cases, those tiles had separated from the terracotta vaulting that they were attached to. So we were very pleased that we actually proceeded with this work because it turns out a lot of those tiles were loose and quite vulnerable, and in some cases about to fall. And then, obviously, while we had the scaffold up, and as part of this Phase 1 earthquake repair project that includes basically the cleaning of the high ceiling on the interior and the 6 flying buttresses on the exterior, we were able to coat and clean this Acoustilith. And you can see from this image, this is an image of the completed and coated crossing ceiling. And if you look immediately sort of down and to the right, that is actually a masonry vault. If you can tell the difference between which one is an Acoustilith vault and which one is a stone vault, then I'll give you $1. But I think it's very difficult, obviously, to tell the difference between the two, which is great. That was our intent. And we have heard from our musicians that the acoustic properties, the reverberation has improved by about 12 to 15%. So next time you're here in the cathedral, sit down on the nave and you tell us whether you discern either a visual difference or an acoustic difference, because that was the whole purpose to go through with this, is to make sure we didn't change what it looked like, but we did change what you heard. And as we come to conclusion for this Phase 1 work, the side aisle work, that Acoustilith work that I mentioned, is just wrapping up. We have these green lifts that are exiting our building gradually, and all of these green lifts will be out of the building by the middle of June. Actually, we gave the contractor a little bit of a deadline. We scheduled a celebratory evensong to celebrate the completion of our Phase 1 work and asked that the contractor sponsor the reception following. So I think that was enough motivation for them to make sure they wrapped up their work and got these green monsters out of the building and wrapped up their work. But here these are the green monsters I was referring to, the lifts that they use. We did use these lifts on the side aisles instead of scaffold because they're more flexible and allowed us to do this work during the day, but park these vehicles at night and not have to interrupt our Sunday service, etc. So we've talked a lot about the inside. I think it's important to mention the work that we have done on the outside as part of this Phase 1 work. This is a great image here. We did take the bishop on a tour of the earthquake repair, including taking her up on the scaffold on the outside of the building. And she looks a little shocked. That's mostly because she leaned against that pinnacle and the pinnacle moved. So I think she was a little surprised to witness firsthand just how vulnerable a lot of these pinnacles were after the earthquake. We did have our stone carvers do a series of prototypes for Dutchman repairs. So Dutchman repairs are where you carve pieces of stone to fit into areas where stone has either cracked or spalled off. And they set up prototypes for us to tell the contractor the level of expertise and quality we wanted in our work. And then once the contractor got on board, one of the things that they were doing that was most challenging about the work on the exterior was the reinforcement. We had to make a decision about how much to intervene with the existing structure of the cathedral to reinforce it post-earthquake. DC doesn't have an earthquake code, so we had to basically work with our engineers to come up with something we were comfortable with that balanced an intervention of modern reinforcement with cost and schedule. And in the end, we came up with a solution where we basically core drilled through the pinnacles to be able to mesh in reinforcement, stainless steel reinforcement rods into these core drills that tied together stone to stone. And then we infilled the gaps around those rods with grout so that it tied the rods to the stones that they were meshed through. We did this for the 6 pinnacles on the 12 pinnacles on the 6 flying buttresses on the east end.
Yeah, I guess the unique thing about the flying buttresses of the apse is that those piers are freestanding, and in the quake, they did this. The rest of the flying buttresses on the cathedral are called engaged buttresses, so the pier is actually built into the wall, and those remained much more stable. But yeah, those 6 flying buttresses of the apse moved in a way that the others did not.
So obviously we were dealing with the buttresses and the pinnacles, but the buttresses themselves, we went through a whole process of deciding how to reinforce those, and the end conclusion, the end design, included drilling basically a 22-foot, 3-inch diameter hole from the outside of what Joe described as the buttress towers through the flyers. Each buttress has 2 flyers that attach from the buttress tower back to the exterior wall of the cathedral. And we basically drilled diagonally upwards and downwards a 22-foot hole that then went into the exterior wall of the cathedral by about 18 inches. And that was all to provide this hole to then be able to mesh the stainless steel rod in and then pump grout into that hole to solidify the stainless steel rod within that hole. It's sort of like when you pour concrete and you put reinforcement in before you pour the concrete. We were just doing it retroactively. And of course, we asked the contractor when they started the work, we said, when was the last time you ever drilled a 22-foot hole into a 100-year-old buttress of a cathedral? Of course, their answer was, well, we've never done that. But fortunately, they have done a lot of other things that were similar in extent as to drilling holes in existing structures. So we did get a certain comfort level with it. One thing we did ask them to do, which was even more challenging, is we asked them to dry drill, which means they don't pump water in when you're using the drill bit to cut down the heat while they're drilling. And we did that because we didn't want to be pumping water into a 22-foot hole, not knowing where the water might seep out. And in retrospect, we're really happy we chose that path, because one of the things we found as we pumped air into these holes to get the dust out, because we weren't doing a dry drill, the air found voids, and in one of the drills it actually found enough voids so that it pushed all the dust that the drilling was causing out into the inside of the cathedral and caused a huge plume of dust on the inside of the cathedral at the high altar about 2 hours before we were having a wedding. So needless to say, we were relieved we didn't go the water path, because that would have been water instead of dust. So it all worked out in the end. And here are some images of the workmen drilling holes on the right-hand photo into the underside of the flyers to reinforce those stones back to the main structure of the flyers.
Each one of those stones took 4 stainless steel rods, pinning it back up into the underside.
And then here are images of the actual drilling device. So the drilling device is set in place. It has drill bits that are about 3 foot in length. So they drill in 3 feet, then pull it out, empty out the stone they've drilled, put another drill bit on, and keep drilling. And it's interesting to see the shapes of some of the voids that came out as a result of the drilling. Most of them were cylindrical, but some of them were sort of egg-shaped or oblong, unusual shapes. And here you can see the workmen are actually cleaning up after the drill. You can see the starter hole at the outer face of the buttress tower and the bucket full of the cores that were a result of the core drills. And the similar technique, as I mentioned, was done with the pinnacles. They just did it vertically instead of diagonally. So they were starting from the top and drilling down into those stones at the pinnacles.
Kind of like drilling for oil.
Yeah.
Same principle. And here's 2 of our on-staff stone carvers, Sean Callahan on the left and Andy Ewell on the right. Andy and Sean are our 2 very talented and skilled stone carvers, and we all worked alongside the contractor who was up there, but Andy and Sean handled most of the very challenging carving repairs, and they really did a fantastic job in duplicating that old ornamentation that was on the old stones there on those flying buttresses.
So basically, we really, I think, accomplished what we hoped to accomplish in that Phase 1 earthquake repair project. We, as I mentioned earlier, raised $10 million. By this point, we've now spent that $10 million, and that included the stabilization after the earthquake, the planning to get this job out for construction, and then the repairs that we implemented on the interior and on the east end. But what I'd like to do is show this diagram that basically shows the extent on the east end that we were able to repair and restore that included those 6 flying buttresses. And you'll see it's really only about 1/8 of the exterior of the cathedral. So that additional $22 million we need to raise are the funds we need to be able to complete the repair work for the rest of the cathedral. And I go back to repeat what I had said earlier, that scaffold on the central tower is really just stabilization scaffold, and it won't go away until we've raised the funds to be able to do the repairs up on that central tower.
And in addition to the central tower, as Jim said, we have a massive pinnacle on the southwest corner of the south transept, and two large damaged pinnacles on the north transept, a couple of damaged pinnacles on the west towers, and many of the smaller buttress pinnacles throughout the nave and other parts of the cathedral that are rotated that don't have scaffolding on them. But as you walk along the cathedral up high and look down, your eye will catch many lesser rotated pieces of stone, but nonetheless, they all have to be addressed.
And basically about 75% of those pinnacles had rotation or damage. And we have areas cordoned off down on the ground that keep people at a certain distance from the cathedral until we can implement those repairs as well. I'd like to show this image just because it reminds people of how we constructed the cathedral. And we had a crane at our central tower that allowed us to reach various areas of the cathedral while we were doing the construction. And we have discussed as planning for phase 2, we may need to put a crane back up on that central tower again in order to accomplish these repairs. And I can't help but show Joe in his younger days, our rock star here, and some of his work. But this is another example, by the way, the west front and the crane that we had in place there that, again, we might need to bring back and resurrect to complete all this work.
Yeah, a tower crane would be the ideal thing to have up on the central tower. It would then have enough boom to, that radius of that boom would be able to catch not only the work on the central tower, but the pinnacles on the south side, the pinnacles on the north side. So it would be the most efficient way of carrying out that phase 2.
So we have been able to raise just under $1 million for phase 2. So as I said, we need $22 million, but so far we've been able to raise about $1 million. And we were authorized by our board to basically go ahead and plan where best to spend that money. And before we could get too far into dialogue, the building spoke to us because a piece of one of the grand pinnacles of the north transept fell off in late March and basically gave us some direction about where our phase 2 funds should go. So we're in the midst of actually talking about how to get scaffolding up and bring back our masons to be able to do those repairs to that north transept pinnacle. And you can see here one of the secondary pinnacles of that grand pinnacle is what fell off and landed on the slipe roof, basically right above the office where our dean is. So suddenly it becomes a very important pinnacle to repair, as you can imagine. And
this is a little story that I'd like to talk about. Right after the earthquake, the photograph on the left shows some coins, and then the photograph is of me up on the roof of the central tower the day of the earthquake. My colleague Sean Callahan and I were the first ones up on the central tower about an hour and a half after the quake. But in the days after the quake, as we began removing all the damaged stones that fell on the tower, again, what happened on the central tower, the pinnacle, the finials on top of the pinnacles fell off and struck the roof and were destroyed. And as we began dismantling those pieces of stone and lowering them down to the ground, I noticed on the course of stone where the finial, the last stone, sat on top of the pinnacle, that layer of mortar, as we were taking the stones apart, I noticed some coins pressed into the mortar. And I immediately knew, I did it, we did it on the West Towers when we were building, and it's something that people do when they build houses. They'll leave a coin here or there, but I know exactly what happened there is the masons who were topping off those pinnacles pulled out a coin and pressed it into the mortar. So the 4 coins there on the bottom were under the southwest pinnacle of the central tower. And then there were a couple of more coins under the southeast. There was a nickel under the northeast pinnacle, and then another nickel and penny under the northwest pinnacle. But you know that what happened, the men who were installing those final stones, that topping off ceremony, and we learned that it was the 16th of October, 1963, when they did the ceremony to cap off the central tower on the northeast and northwest corners. And Dean Sayer was up on the northeast pinnacle. Mr. Froman, the original architect of the cathedral, was on the northwest. So it's kind of neat to think that those coins might have been pressed into the mortar by the dean and by Mr. Froman back then. So kept the coins, I cleaned them up, I have them in that little frame on my desk. I look at them every day, and it would be a great thing to think that we could rebuild that central tower and the pinnacles and put those coins back where they belong.
Thank you for spending time with us today and hearing our restoration update as to how we've advanced with our Phase 1 earthquake repairs. And we look forward to sharing with you advancements in our Phase 2 repairs as they progress. And please also check out our website. There is an update on our restoration efforts, not just about the earthquake repairs, but about all of the other restoration efforts we are underway with to be good stewards of our historic building.